Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. What I've got here for you today is the HiFiMan HE-R9. This is a closed back, wired, all wireless headphone from HiFiMan that retails for $599 US, although at the time I was writing my notes for this review, it was $369 US on Amazon. So depending on where you go, you may find it cheaper than $599, but $599 is the list price, and that's generally what I focus on when considering what to compare a headphone with. It's other things around the price point or maybe a bit cheaper. So I do, as usual, have a couple of comparisons in this review, but I'm also going to keep things quite short because there's not a huge amount to cover off. To get things started though, let me introduce the HE-R9. As I said in the intro, this is a $600 US wireless closed back headphone. Although when I say wireless, it's wireless because of the dongle here, which removes, and so it's also a wired headphone should you want it to be, and it does come with the cable that you need. As a wired headphone, these are a 32 ohm, 100 decibel sensitivity headphone, making them very easy to drive from anything at all that you're likely to drive them with. Or of course you can use the supplied Blue Mini R2R dongle, so yes, this is an R2R wireless DAC. You can use this plugged in to make it a fully wireless pair of headphones as well. So it's a great versatile device. You can use it with a USB cable direct from your computer, you can use it wireless via aptX HD, LDAC, etc. Or you can plug in traditional 3.5mm connections and make it a fully wired headphone. So versatility wise, this is fantastic. I'll talk about sound quality in a moment, but I do want to bring up one issue I have before we go too far, and that is that the level of the notifications from the R2R dongle is absolutely insane. It's to the level of being uncomfortable. Now I did talk about this with the Deva Pros that use the exact same dongle. It was loud on those, but I feel like it's even louder coming through the R9 because they might be a bit more sensitive. And so what that means is if you are going to get yourself a pair of R9s and use the wireless dongle, do be prepared to switch it on and off with the headphones off your head, because otherwise it's not quite deafening, but it's well on the way there. I think HiFiMan need to come up with a firmware update that massively reduces the sound level of those various notifications. And what I mean by the notifications is when it tells you that it's powered on and then it tells you that it's connected, there's also a beep that follows that that's quite piercing, and the same thing for shutting down. So that's a huge gripe for me. I hate the level of volume that comes out of this when you're switching it on and off, but it's not quite a deal breaker. It's just something that makes it a bit of a hassle having to have the headphones off your head for any of those interactions. Before we jump straight into sound quality, the other thing I want to mention is the build. Now these look pretty special. They've got this really fancy style design that's intended to reduce or remove entirely any standing waves and reflections inside the cups. And the paint finish on them is very nice, but it is worth noting they don't feel quite as good as they look. They don't feel bad by any stretch. It's the same exact headband that we've seen before from HiFiMan on things like the HE-400 series, and they're fine. There's nothing wrong with that headband at all. It gives you a nice comfortable fit, but the cups themselves feel very lightweight and quite plasticky as well. So do be aware of that. It's not a bad thing at all, but I wanted to raise the fact that they don't feel quite as premium as they look in the photos. The final design piece that I've alluded to, but I want to clarify, is that on the bottom of each of the headphones, you do have a 3.5mm socket. One of these sockets, that being the one on the left-hand side, is designed for the R2R Blue Mini because that's got multiple connectors on the pin. There's a total of 4 connectors on the 3.5mm jack coming out of the Blue Mini, and so it has to go into the left-hand side. But then when you remove the Blue Mini, you've got sockets for 2 3.5mm entries, and that means you can run it balanced from a different amplifier if you want to, or single-ended too. So as I said before, very versatile thanks to these 2 entries, but do remember the Blue Mini can only go on one side as far as I'm aware. And so with that said, let's start talking about sound. I'm going to start off talking about these as a wired headphone because I think that's really where they're most suited, what they're really designed for based on how they come in the package. And the good news is that overall, I think they're a really nice sounding headphone, but they've definitely got their own character and it's not going to be for everybody. The most obvious thing that I noticed the second I put these on was that they've definitely got a rich and warm sound to them. These are quite a departure from the neutrality of things like the Deva and the Deva Pro or the HE-400 series. They're really quite a rich, warm headphone and I like that. But as I said before, some people it's going to be too much for. What I find particularly interesting about the sound from the R9s though, is that even though they're a closed headphone, and therefore they do produce a fairly intimate and small head stage, as in a sound stage that's within the head, within that space, they seem to produce a good sense of three-dimensionality still. And I'll put that more into context with a couple of comparisons soon, but I've been really impressed with the way these managed to produce a soundstage where the vocalist is kind of up, maybe just slightly in front of your forehead or level with the forehead, and then the music kind of spreads out around the inside of the head from there. So it is an intimate experience, but it's not lacking in a sense of space, the sounds are well separated, and generally it's quite enjoyable to listen to. As you'd expect from me having said that they're a warm and rich sounding headphone, they've got a fair bit of bass energy coming out from the R9s, and what I find is that it doesn't extend all the way down, but it's pretty impressive for what they are, meaning that you're getting good enough bass extension. There's just that last octave or so where it does start to taper off a bit, and you do hear the difference if you listen to something that extends all the way to 20 Hz, and then you listen to these, there is just that last tiny bit missing, but only really electronic music is going to make the most of that last little bit. And they're not bad in that regard. I just wanted to clarify that they don't extend all the way down to 20 Hz with a dead flat response curve. That said, what they deliver is an excellent deep extension bass response, and there's plenty of presence and energy behind it as well. But it is worth noting they're not the fastest responding bass around. They've got a touch of slowness to them, and I don't mean that in a bad way. They don't get muddy or thick or anything like that, but I am aware that they're just a little bit slower than some of the other headphones I've tried, particularly probably some of the planers from HiFiMan, which tend to be quite quick and snappy in the bass. What that means in the context of listening to music is that I find these are really enjoyable on, say, classical, acoustic, so jazz, more acoustic rock, that sort of thing. But if you're looking for something that's fast and snappy in the bass, whether it's for electronic music or faster rock, these aren't necessarily the fastest thing around. They're not bad, as I said before, they don't get muddy and slow as such, but you will be aware if you're used to a fast sounding headphone that these have just got a little bit more of a laid back presentation to the bass. Just a little bit, but it's definitely there. What that means as I started to listen to more and more music on them was that on a lot of tracks they sound fantastic. On tracks with a bit more upper register information, so things where you've got, say, acoustic guitars and strumming or a lot of percussion work in the higher registers from snares and cymbals, things like that, I find that they're really fantastic when you're looking to balance off bass with a bit of upper register energy. Where they're not quite so good is if you've got a track that's already quite warm, quite rich, and quite full in the bass. They can get just a little bit too much there sometimes. Basically, as I listened to lots and lots of different music through the HE-R9, what I found was that they're a little bit variable. When they hit the sweet spot, they sound fantastic. So on some good acoustic and sort of slower electronic blues, they sounded fantastic. They really bring the focus into the vocals, they let you hear all the emotion and the richness in the vocals, they're fantastic in that area. But on some other tracks, they can just miss the mark a little bit. They're never bad, but sometimes that bit of richness does take it a touch too far, as I've already said. And so I was curious to see how much of that was coming from the R2R Blue Mini dongle and how much was the headphone itself. And so I went from using the R2R Blue Mini, I was using LDAC in case I didn't mention that before, and I switched over to using the Cord Mojo 2, so a very clean, very neutral source. And what I found was that the R9s with the Mojo 2 were very, very similar still to the Blue Mini. As you'd expect, going from a wireless source to a wired source, there was an increase in sense of clarity and detail retrieval or resolution from the Mojo 2, but the tonality of the headphone didn't change. It was still very much a warm and rich sounding delivery with just a bit more clarity in the top end now. I also felt like the sound was just a little tiny bit more spacious coming from the Mojo 2, but again it wasn't a drastic shift. It was an incremental couple of percent and very much what I'd expect going from a quality wireless device to a quality wired device. So if you're looking at buying yourself a pair of HE-R9s, do know that they're definitely going to be rich and warm sounding headphones, and I mean that in the best possible sense, but they're going to be that whether you're using the dongle or whether you're using a separate source. And so that brought me around to some comparisons. One of the obvious comparisons that I did consider was the Deva Pro, but I ended up scrapping that as one of my comparisons because A, it's open versus closed back, and if you're not after a closed back headphone specifically, then basically you should watch the review of this, watch the review of the Deva, and see which one sounds like it's right for you. I don't see them as really being direct competitors, even though they've both got the same dongle and they're both in HiFiMan's range. In short, they're completely differently tuned headphones, with the Deva's a bit more neutral. This is obviously warm and rich, one's open and therefore the Deva's got more space to it in terms of left-right space, versus the R9 being closed and therefore having that much more intimate presentation. So I'm not going to do a full comparison there. Check out my Deva Pro review if you want to know more about the Deva. If you don't like the sound of this being rich and warm, just go straight to the Deva Pro review and check that one out instead. But if you're looking for a closed back headphone, wireless or non-wireless, we'll get to that in a second, then I do have a couple of comparisons that might make more sense. I just realised that I forgot to mention before, for anyone who's wondering, the headphone stand I'm using here is the Benks headphone stand. Benks were kind enough to send me one of these to check out. This isn't a full review, it's also not a sponsored piece or anything like that, but I did agree that if they sent me one, I'd talk about it on some videos. As you can see, the headphone stand has a fairly narrow and curved section for the headband, so it doesn't suit all headbands well, but for something like the HiFiMan HE-400 type headband, it works really well, and you can sit the headphones on there nicely. In addition to that, it's got a wireless charger built into the base for your phone, but it is worth mentioning that once you've got a pair of headphones on here, with wires attached in particular, you're not going to have very much space for your phone. So it's more suitable when your headphones are on to charge your phone, rather than maybe holding a pair of headphones you're not using all the time and trying to charge your phone underneath. So do be aware of that if you're interested in this headphone stand. It's not going to work so well if you're not using your headphones at the time. Beyond that though, it's a really nicely constructed stand with a good sense of weight. It's got metal in all the key places and then some nice rubber or silicone to protect your headphone. And other than the fact that it's limited to only working for headphones with quite narrow bands, I think it's a really great choice. So check out my link down below where I've got all the products I recommend. This product is in that list. Just click through and you'll see a database of all the different products that I've reviewed and personally recommend, with links through to various retailers depending on what I've been able to find. For now though, that's enough about the headphone stand. Let's get back to talking about the headphone. And the first one is the drop THX Pandas. Now, the drop Pandas have had a few issues with quality control. Some of them have failed entirely. Mine has noise that comes through the Bluetooth. I don't know if those things have been solved, and it's a bit of a shame because there's a lot going for the Pandas if it weren't for those problems. But I still decided to do the comparison in case you've heard the Pandas and or you're looking to upgrade or replace your Pandas, or maybe they're still available, I haven't actually checked that, and you wanted to see which one to buy. It is worth noting that the Pandas offer a lot more control of things. You've got the Sound ID app, so you can tweak their sound, and you've also got the joystick button on the side of the Pandas, which is a nice easy interface for skipping forwards, backwards, changing volume, etc. The R2R Blue Mini is a much more basic Bluetooth device, and so in terms of feature sets, the Pandas have it all over the R9. But if we're just talking sound and using the Pandas as a reference point to compare to the R9s, then things are a little bit more nuanced. One of the tracks I listened to while doing this test was called To Love Forever by William Fitzsimmons. And starting off with the R9s, and this was all wireless testing, the sound from the R9s was wonderfully focused through the vocals. It really drew my attention into those vocals and separated them really well from the backing track. I do feel like the guitars were maybe just a little bit muted coming from the R9 because of that bit of richness and smoothness. They weren't bad. There was still some texture and a little bit of attack to them. They were quite articulate, but I do feel like in the mix, they were taking a little bit too much of a backseat perhaps. When I moved over to the Pandas, what I immediately noticed most was that they're a very left-right sound compared to that interesting sense of three-dimensionality that the R9s produce. So there was a good sense of space left to right, but not very much depth. Everything was either in the left ear, the right ear, or kind of dead center, but all in a plane, rather than having that ability to stretch forward and up into the forehead area. In terms of tonality, the Pandas are able to be tweaked and adjusted through the Sound ID app, and I do like that feature once you get it working, which can be a bit of a fiddle. So tonally, the Pandas are a bit more variable than the R9, which is just as it comes. But I think unless you go to extremes with the Sound ID app, the Pandas are always going to be a more neutral overall sound. Whereas the R9s are very clearly a coloured presentation, which in my opinion is being done well and is enjoyable, but some will prefer the more neutral tonality of the Pandas. One final thing that stood out to me as I flicked back and forth between the two was that the R9 is clearly the more liquid and richer and warmer sounding headphone, but the key point being the liquidity. You know about the warmth and the richness, but there's also a character to the sound, and that is that the dynamic drivers from the R9s are allowing the music to kind of flow out more easily, more organically you could say, whereas no matter how you set up the Pandas in terms of the sound ID tweaks, it always has a slightly drier tonality to it. There's a little bit of, I don't want to say graininess because they're not grainy as such, but it's like there's a drier, kind of crisper, grainier, I'm not quite sure the term for it, but a tonality or character is probably a better word from the Pandas that's never quite going to match that liquidity and that articulation that you get from the R9s. And I really enjoy that about the R9s. And so for me, between the two of them, if I had to choose one, it would be a very tough choice. I think the Pandas are going to be more consistently good across a wider range of music and for therefore a wider range of preferences, but the R9s have a bit of magic. That magic occasionally goes too far and they kind of trip over themselves a little bit, but that's probably only 10% of tracks, and the rest of the time they're thoroughly enjoyable. They're a more romanticised presentation of the music, but sometimes that's what some of us want to hear. And so for me, I think I enjoy the music more across the board from the R9s, but I do recognise that that's going to come with the occasional stumble. And so my next step was to think about, what if you had that money to spend, say $600 and you wanted a portable solution, but maybe it wasn't all about wireless so much as just being portable and good quality sound. I happen to have here at the moment the HiFiMan HE-R7DX, which is a more budget, wide closed-back headphone from HiFiMan, and I've also got the Moondrop Moon River 2 dongle DAC. So both of those are coming up for review in separate reviews, so make sure you subscribe and ring the notification bell if you want to catch those. But I thought, what if we pair the two of those up? If we put the HE-R7DX headphone and the Moondrop Moon River 2 dongle DAC together, we're actually getting a combination that's a bit cheaper than the list price of the R9 and maybe can sound better. So I gave that a go. One of the tracks I tried for this comparison was track 1 by Till Brunner, and it sounded absolutely wonderful on the HE-R9. Again, this is just using the HE-R9 with its included dongle. Once again, the soundstage was quite small and relatively narrow, but with a good sense of space, so that little three-dimensional head stage again. And there was a nice balance between the warmth and richness in this track, but still enough clarity and texture up top to bring things like the breathiness of the muted trumpet forward and just keep everything sounding pretty well tonally balanced. When I jumped over to the wide HE-R7DX using the Moon River 2 dongle DAC, what I heard was a much more transparent sound at first. And I say transparent meaning that I felt like I could hear more of what was going on because the overall presentation was more neutral. Whereas with a coloured sound like in the R9, it's going to emphasise certain parts of the music at the detriment of others. Now that can be a good thing if it sounds good, but for those wanting to hear a more neutral representation of exactly what's in the recording, then the R7DX with the Moon River 2 is the more neutral and therefore more transparent presentation. Once again though, much like the Drop Panda, hearing the same track through the R7DX as I'd heard from the R9 really showed me that wonderful sense of three-dimensionality that the R9 produces despite the relatively small head stage. The R7DX was once again very left-right with not much depth in the soundstage at all. It's not to say that the R7DX was bad, but it did highlight for me that the R9 is quite special in the way it presents the sound. I do think, having compared the two back and forth quite a bit, that those who prefer a sense of clarity and neutrality are going to prefer the R7DX. And I'll cover that off fully in its own review as to exactly what its tonality is, where its points of emphasis are, all of that sort of stuff. But for now, I'm just going to say that I think the R7DX is stronger on clarity and neutrality than the R9, but in some ways it's also the opposite of the R9, where on those fuller tracks the R9 can sometimes sound a bit too rich and a bit too warm. Those same fuller sounding tracks can also show that the R7DX doesn't necessarily have the presence and the weight down low to do justice to tracks that actually need it. And so when both headphones are operating in that middle ground, so a normally mixed track with a good balance of bass and treble, then each headphone has its place with its own enjoyable character. Transparency and clarity from the R7DX versus warmth, richness, and that lovely sense of liquidity from the R9. Now, of course, if you want a more wireless solution, there are plenty of other dongles you can buy that are Bluetooth dongles, like say a FiiO BTR5 or a Shanling UP4, I think it was called. Any of those are going to do the same sort of job and give you a similar outcome. So you could choose the R7DX and make it a semi-wireless headphone if you prefer the sound of that, or stick with the R9 as a nice compact all-in-one solution. And I say compact meaning the dongle is attached to the device rather than having a wire to a separate little box. And so to bring all this to a close, I think the HE-R9 is a very enjoyable headphone so long as you know what you're getting. If you enjoy a nice, rich, warm, but articulate and liquid sound, then I think the R9s can be great. Certainly my first impression when I put them on was a big smile on my face. I thoroughly enjoyed what I heard from them. They will trip up and get a bit too rich and thick on the occasional track, but it's not that common in my experience so long as you like a warmer sound. They produce a wonderful, intimate and nicely focused sound, particularly focused on vocals, and whatever the main soloist is, they really bring that into attention. So if you're looking for a relaxing and enjoyable listen with a bit of warmth and a bit of richness, but still a good sense of articulation in the sound, then I think the HE-R9 is definitely worth a look. Particularly if you can pick it up at that lower price of say $369, I think they're a really good choice. And so hopefully what I've shared here today has been helpful for you. If it has, as always, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. And if there's anything I haven't covered in this review that you wanted to know about the HE-R9, drop me a comment down below and ask away. I'll do my best to answer. For now though, let me leave it to the music. So happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.